like you, after you hear the talk, you'll retract the applause. I don't think I have enough ideas to fill out 45 minutes, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ramble on for a few minutes and then let Dick do the real substantive work. Well, I'm just going to look at some problems about the number of aggressors and proportionality in a range of cases. And the talk has a really exciting conclusion, and that conclusion is I don't have a solution to the big problem. The exciting conclusion is here's this very interesting and difficult and important theoretical challenge, and David Roden has a proposal, and I've got a proposal, and maybe David's work's better than mine, but I'm not really happy with either one of them. So that's where we'll wind up. So don't hold your breath. Let me begin with a case about which some of us will have differing intuitions. I'll just make it first personal. Imagine that hard to believe, imagine that I'm an innocent person and that there are 1,000 fully culpable assassins lined up outside the door, forming a nice queue throughout the garden area out there, and each of them is going to come through the door and try to kill me. And it seems to me that each one of these people is individually liable to be killed. That is, this is a paradigm instance of self-defense in each case. I'm a completely innocent potential victim. This person is a fully culpable threatener. So if we look at these cases of defensive killing in a pairwise manner, it seems that in each case, each of these people is morally liable to be killed, and it's permissible for me to kill them. And it seems that that's going to be true in each successive case. So each one of them who comes through the door is going to be liable to be killed by me, but there are 1,000 of them. The question is, does the fact that there are 1,000 of them make it disproportionate for me to kill them all? Many of us think it doesn't, that I've got a justification in each individual case, and we don't need to worry about the aggregation of the numbers here. So I've got a sufficient justification for each instance of killing. And to a lot of us that seems intuitive. It just does seem that there's never going to be a point at which I am morally required to submit to being killed by a fully culpable killer just because I've killed a lot of other ones in the past. But if I'm never going to reach a limit when I start going, then there's the question, should I start at all? Certainly it seems to me to be true that if I can't kill them all, I shouldn't kill any of them. That is, I should just submit to being killed by the very first one. Because in that, to think otherwise would be to violate the necessity requirement. That is, it's unnecessary for me to kill any of the initial ones if it's not going to do me any good, if I'm not going to survive at the end of the day. But some people think that even in this case, the pairwise comparisons don't tell the whole story. Like I said, if one anticipates that the number of these culpable killers one would have to kill in order to survive is sufficiently large, it becomes a moral requirement to submit right at the outset and not kill any of them. Like different people have different intuitions about this. I mean, it's not an easy problem. My intuition is, I think that it's permissible for me to kill all of them. I think that's Tom Herka's view, and it's Doug Lackey's view, and a number of other people. But then there are other people who think that there's a limit to the number even of fully culpable killers that it would be proportionate for me to kill. I think David Roden has that view, or did when we last spoke. And I think Dick Arneson has that view as well. One problem I have with that view of the problem is that whatever is true about self-defense also ought to be true about third-party defense of another. So if there is a limit to the number of fully culpable killers that I may proportionately kill in self-defense, then there must similarly be some limit to the number of fully culpable killers it's permissible or proportionate for me to kill in defense of another innocent person. Well, then think about, what's the number? Let's make it really large. Suppose that I can kill up to 1 million culpable killers to defend myself, but not more than that. But then if you apply that to third-party defense of other innocent people, and that means that it wouldn't be permissible for us to kill 1 trillion Hitlers to prevent them from killing 1 million Jews. Can we accept that? Is that really plausible? I thought yesterday when I was thinking about this on the plane that the issues that Seth was discussing about proportionality and time are relevant to this question, but it seems like maybe they're not. It may well be true that the number of culpable killers I've killed in the past is irrelevant to how many it's proportionate for me to kill in the future, but that still leaves open the problem that at each point looking forward there may be a limit to the number I may kill. So the problem remains even if we take the position that I think is right on the question of harms that we have already incurred, to use Sava's term. I'm going to come back to this problem, but right now I'm going to move on to another one. It's related. These are all problems about proportionality in numbers. This one is the problem one of the problems that was raised in Helen's talk early today. And it's related to the comment that I made in the discussion that in cases of what I'm going to call lesser aggression, that is when the harms with which people are threatened by some instance of aggression are what I would call lesser harms, that is harms involving some degree of loss of political self-determination, loss of territory, loss of wealth or resources, something like that, but where there's no unconditional threat to kill anybody or enslave anybody or expel anybody from the territory or torture anybody or anything like that. In those cases, if the lesser aggression is not resisted by military force, what that means is that what's threatened by each of the lesser aggressors is, I think, only a really tiny contribution by each individual lesser aggressor to the harm suffered by each individual victim. So if I'm one of the lesser aggressors and Seth, let's say, is one of the individual victims of the lesser aggression, then the amount of harm that Seth suffers that can be attributable to my contribution to the aggression is going to be really, really tiny. And there are going to be a large number of such victims. But since I'm not in a combatant's role, I'm not actually going out and killing individual people. I'm just part of this force that's there to demand surrender and get whatever the lesser goods are that we want. I don't actually have to inflict any grave harm on any particular individual. So that's the situation, or at least we can imagine cases like this. Imagine a case in which there are a number of lesser aggressors, and there's, let's say, a very large number of victims of the lesser harm that these lesser aggressors will together inflict on the population that's the target of the aggression, in that kind of case, each of the lesser aggressors isn't going to be responsible for more than a tiny harm to any individual person. So the question is whether those tiny harms that are inflicted on a large number of individuals aggregate in such a way as to make the individual lesser aggressor liable to be killed in defense. Now, it's relevant to that whether we think whether these lesser aggressors are fully culpable or minimally culpable or even only minimally responsible. That's relevant. But let me just put that dimension of the problem aside, and let's make a realistic assumption in the case of war that the aggressors on the unjust side are minimally culpable for what they're doing. That is, they're not evil, wicked people, but they're not people who are just merely responsible. There's some element of culpability there as well. It also seems plausible to think that the harm to which a person can be liable is limited by the amount of harm that he will otherwise cause and by the degree of his responsibility for the harm that he will cause. And so I've just now given you the assumptions I'm making about both of those dimensions of the basis of liability. So in the case of each lesser aggressor is minimally culpable for the infliction of absolutely tiny harms on a large number of victims. Can any of those lesser aggressors be morally liable to be killed for that? If not, can there be any moral justification for resisting the lesser aggression by military means? That's one way of stating the problem that Helen was addressing earlier in her paper. A lot here depends on whether the tiny harms aggregate and can aggregate in a way that can make a person liable to be killed. I'll come back to that in a second. It seems to me, though, that if the lesser aggression could be defeated by killing only a relatively small number of these lesser aggressors, it might be permissible to resist in that way by killing these lesser aggressors. But it might seem that if the number of the lesser aggressors that have to be killed in order to prevent the lesser aggression from succeeding is quite large, then it would be disproportionate to kill them. That raises the question, can the difference in numbers here be relevant to the question of individual liability? So again, there's this problem about individual liability and numbers. Here's one way to think about the problem. Suppose that each lesser aggressor makes the same contribution to the harm that they will together inflict. And that's reasonably plausible in cases of lesser aggression that is unresisted. Lesser aggression when there's capitulation by the victims who then sort of give to the aggressors whatever it was they wanted. So you imagine that each lesser aggressor makes the same contribution to the aggregate harm that they are together going to cause. If the goal of the unjust aggression remains constant, what that means is that the causal contribution that each aggressor makes to the harm they together inflict decreases the more aggressors there are. Now I said, how can numbers be relevant to liability? Well, that's part of the explanation, what I just said, it seems to me. That is, if there are relatively few lesser aggressors and the number of victims is large, then each lesser aggressor may be making a fairly substantial contribution to the aggregate harm. In that case, the aggregate harm he causes or is responsible for may be sufficiently great that he's liable to be killed as a means of preventing it. And that's because whether or not a person is liable to be killed depends on how much harm that he would otherwise do will be averted by killing him. Now, here's another problem that I'll just mention here. I think this actually isn't in the paper that Dick saw, so he won't have anything prepared to say about this. So I apologize in advance to that. And that is that it seems to me that it may make a difference to whether a person is liable to be killed to prevent his contributions to the harm suffered by many victims, how bad those harms are for each individual victim. Let me bring that out by comparing two versions of Parfit's harmless torturers case. I'm trying to decide whether to give you the first case. Maybe it'll help. So I'll give you Parfit's two cases and then my third case. Parfit begins with a case in which you've got 1,000 torturers, and each of them tortures one victim really horribly. So you've got 1,000 torturers, 1,000 victims, each victim horribly tortured, but by one person. Second version of the case is this. The torturers decide to use a second method. They decide we're going to change their method. So what they do is each one of them causes 1/1,000th the pain of torture to each of the 1,000 victims. Imagine them each having 1,000 buttons, and they each press their 1,000 buttons, and in doing so, each one of them inflicts a tiny bit of pain on each of 1,000 people, but because there are 1,000 people doing that, the end result is the same as it was in the first case. You get 1,000 people together causing 1,000 other people to experience terrible torture. In that case, it seems to me that we should think that all the torturers in the second case are liable to be killed if certain conditions are met. I won't go into those conditions right now. There are interesting differences between the liability of the harmless torture, or of the torturers in the first case, when each one tortures one victim, and the harmless torturers in the second case, where each person doesn't inflict more than a tiny bit of pain on any individual victim. But it does seem to me to be true that if it's permissible in the first case for, let's say, each victim to kill his own torturer so that all 1,000 torturers get killed, if that's justifiable and each one of those people is liable to be killed, then we can imagine a solution to the second problem, and it's a practical solution, whereby one of the victims or a third party or all the victims together can collectively kill all 1,000 of the harmless torturers, the ones who are just pressing 1,000 buttons. Suppose they can't kill any fewer than 1,000. They can kill either 0 or 1,000. It seems to me that they are justified in killing all 1,000 in the same way that they would be justified in the first case in killing all 1,000. But now imagine a third harmless torturer's case. In the third case, each of the 1,000 people does exactly what he does in the second case. That is, he presses 1,000 buttons, causing a tiny bit of pain to each of 1,000 victims. But in this particular case, each harmless torturer's victims, his 1,000 victims, are different from every other harmless torturer's victims. So that in this case, what you've got is 1,000 people, each of whom is inflicting a tiny bit of pain on 1,000 different people. But what you've got in this case, rather than having 1,000 harmers and 1,000 people being tortured, is 1,000 harmers and 1,000,000 people all experiencing a tiny, barely perceptible amount of pain. In that case, is it permissible to kill any of the 1,000 people pushing their buttons? It seems to me it is not. So it seems to me that there's a condition here that whether a person makes himself liable to be killed as a means of preventing him from inflicting a tiny harm on each of a very large number of people depends a lot on what the background conditions are and what the condition of the victim is at the time that the harm is inflicted. And in particular, in this particular case, it depends on what other people are doing. So these could be the same 1,000 people, the same 1,000 harmers, and whether they are liable to be killed or not will depend on whether their victims are the same people or different people. Depends on whether, if I'm one of them, my 1,000 victims are also Saba's and Seth's and Victor's victims. That will determine whether we're liable to be killed or not. That seems an odd thing to suppose could be true, but I think as far as I can tell, I think it is true. Okay, now go back to the problem of lesser aggression. That was a kind of detour raised by what I said about one part of the discussion of lesser aggression. Now return centrally to the discussion of lesser aggression. It seems to me that if you have a fixed number of victims of the lesser aggression, and the goals of the lesser aggressors remain constant, but you increase the number of lesser aggressors, there's going to be some point at which the number of lesser aggressors gets sufficiently high that none of them is any longer liable to be killed. That is, if there are a fixed number of victims, fixed harms to the victims, and a relatively small number of lesser aggressors, they can all be liable to be killed because their contributions are fairly significant. But if you increase the number of the lesser aggressors, what you're doing is making it the case that the contribution that each one makes to the harms that any one individual suffers decreases. And it decreases in proportion to the increase in the number. So there's got to be some number of the lesser aggressors such that it then becomes impermissible to kill them, and that's because an increase in their numbers has eliminated each individual aggressor's liability to be killed by reducing that individual aggressor's causal contribution to the harms that they together inflict. Now, I think that's plausible. It's just to say that numbers affect the causal contribution that a person can make to a harm that people are inflicting together. And if the harm that can be attributed to an individual's action goes below a certain threshold, that person ceases to be liable to be killed as a means of preventing that amount of harm, preventing him from causing that amount of harm. But although I think that's plausible, I don't think it follows that killing the lesser aggressors in this kind of situation would necessarily be impermissible. And that's because I think there's another form of justification that may be helpful here. And I think it's a form of justification that has been underappreciated. So I'll say a little something about that now. I've just realized I don't have a watch or anything like that, so I have no idea what time it is or how to tell when I should stop. Okay, thank you. Okay. And how do I get it to? Just press the sorry, I don't know how to do these high-tech contraptions.
Just press that button.
Okay. Thank you. Good. I thought I could read this. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm within the scope of this technology, except the damn wristband. It won't let me lay the bloody thing flat. Oh well. All right. Sorry. At least I'm not up here, fiddling around with unable to control what's it called? PowerPoint. Yeah. Because usually sophisticated people have PowerPoint problems. I have problems reading an analog watch face. Okay. Here's the idea. Suppose it's the case that there are so many lesser aggressors who are contributing to this, the harm that they're collectively going to inflict on us, that none of them is actually liable to be killed. there still might be a way of justifying killing them, or killing some of them anyway, or maybe enough of them to succeed in thwarting the aggression. The idea is this: each one of them, though not liable to be killed, is liable in principle to some level of harm, some degree of harm, as a means of preventing him from making his contribution to the lesser aggression. We can justify the infliction of that much harm on this person by appeal to a liability justification. Okay, then there's the remainder of the harm between that degree of harm and the harm of death, however much that is. It might be quite a lot. We could still try to justify the infliction of that additional harm beyond the harm to which the individual is liable by appeal to a lesser evil justification. We could just say, if by inflicting that amount of harm on this individual, we could prevent much greater harm to the innocent victims of the lesser aggression, then we might have a combined justification for killing this person. And as part of the justification would be a liability justification, and part of it would be a lesser evil justification. Harm up to the amount to which he's liable would have a liability justification, and then harm beyond that to which he's liable would have a straightforward lesser evil justification. Now, it might have a very high standard to meet because the infliction of the harm would be intentional, so this would be rather like the intentional infliction of harm on an innocent person because it's not justified on the basis of liability. But in principle, you could have that kind of justification, and if that kind of justification could apply to the killing of enough lesser aggressors to defeat the aggression, then the military response to the lesser aggression would be overall proportionate. Part of it would be narrowly proportionate, and that which was narrowly disproportionate would then be proportionate in the wide sense. There's an interesting wrinkle there. I'll just digress for half a second and say that there is an interesting question raised by this idea of a combined liability lesser evil justification, whether harms that are inflicted on people beyond the harm to which they are liable count exactly like harms to people, equivalent harms to people who are not liable to any harm at all. And I'm not sure how exactly to think about that, but if you think about analogous debates in the morality of punishment, there's an interesting question about whether if we overpunish some guilty person by a certain amount, whether that is wrong to the same degree as the infliction of an equivalent amount of punishment on somebody who's wholly innocent. And a lot of people have the intuition that a certain quantum of overpunishment is less bad than the same quantum of punishment inflicted on a wholly innocent person. I'm not sure what to think about this. I just don't take a stand on that. But that's an issue that's raised by this idea of the combined justification. Let me turn now to. Oh, well, I should also say that there are limits to this, to the application or applicability of what I'm calling the combined justification here. So in the case of lesser aggression, the problem that Helen was talking about, you might have a justification for killing some lesser aggressors on the ground that if there are few enough of them, the amount of harm for which each is responsible is sufficient to make that individual liable to be killed. But of course, if there are many, then that argument ceases to apply because no one of them is causing enough harm on his own to be liable to be killed, but that's when the combined justification takes over. But there are limits to the combined justification as well, and they may be rather severe limits because the second part of the justification, the lesser evil justification, sets a very high standard of justification, particularly in the case of intentional killing, it seems to me. So they're going to be very strict proportionality limits on the permissibility of defensive war against lesser aggression. So my position on that issue is not David's. I'm not sure how it relates to Helen's, but it's a kind of intermediate position. It's different from Seth's, which is, I think, the more traditional view that the defensive war, even in response to lesser aggression, is generally justified. Let me turn now to a different problem. I can introduce this problem with a case not involving numbers. Some of you are familiar with a case that pops up every now and then in the literature that I call the case of the conscientious driver, where you've got somebody who is minimally responsible for a threat of death to an innocent person. The case is one in which somebody voluntarily chooses to drive a car somewhere for self-interested reasons, is very conscientious about maintaining the car and careful driving and that sort of thing, but for reasons that she couldn't anticipate, the car goes out of control and is going to kill an innocent bystander. And the question is whether the innocent bystander may kill this person in self-defense, if that would be effective in saving the bystander's life. My claim is that the person who has chosen to drive is liable to be killed in that instance because this person has made a voluntary choice to expose innocent people to risk. And there's no, the action of driving the car was permissible in the evidence relative sense, but nevertheless, when the risk that this person foreseeably imposes on innocent bystanders in moving a big piece of steel around in that way eventuates in an immediate threat of death, that makes the driver liable to be killed. Now, some people find my view about this problem implausible. Saba's one of those. A number of people think that this person is acting permissibly in the relevant sense. It can't be possible in that way for a person to make herself liable to be killed. As I say, my view is that making that autonomous choice is sufficient for liability in that case. The choice to expose other people to risk means that as a matter of justice in the distribution of this unavoidable harm, it should go to the person who had the choice about whether people were going to be exposed to this risk, not to others. That's just a way of entering into the problem I want to discuss. The problem I want to discuss arises when we ask, what if there were a huge number of people like the conscientious driver? It's not just one person who's minimally responsible for a threat to your life, but a large number. So now imagine a variant of the case with which I began, in which there were 1,000 culpable assassins queued up outside the door, each of whom is going to kill me unless I kill him. Imagine now that there are 1,000 people like the conscientious driver, people who are, they're all queued up out there to kill me, but they're only minimally responsible because, for example, they all reasonably believe that they're morally required to kill me. So they all think they're doing the right thing. They've made a mistake, but it's a non-culpable mistake, something like that. Now, what I think about that kind of case is that, taken individually, each one seems liable to be killed for the same reason that I give in the case of the conscientious driver. If it's just him or me, I think it should be him. But now, in this case, there are 1,000 of them. And the situation is the same as in the case I began with, where there are 1,000 culpable threateners. So if I'm going to survive, I've got to kill all 1,000 of them. In this case, my intuition tells me that there's got to be a limit to the number of such people that it could be permissible for me to kill. These are not evil, wicked, culpable people. They're just people who are minimally responsible. They've made a mistake. Let's suppose that, well, let's state my view, it's just not proportionate for me to kill 1,000 of those people. But again, taken pairwise, it looks like in each case I have a full liability justification for killing each one of them. The explanations that I gave a little while ago, the one about with the increased number, the contribution that each one makes to the threatened harm diminishes, that's not true in this case. You can add as many of them as you like, each one of them still threatens me with death. So the harm that they will cause doesn't diminish at all with their number. And the combined justification doesn't apply in this case because it seems like, taken individually, each one of them is actually liable to be killed, and there's certainly no lesser evil involved in my killing all of them, so that can't work. There's a view that David has developed, and I'm probably, I don't want to father my exposition of this view on David, so what I'm saying may not be exactly David's view. But the idea is roughly this, that while I have a liability reason or justification for killing each one of them, I always have, let's call it a reason of humanity not to kill somebody. And where it's just one-to-one, the liability justification wins out over the reason of humanity that I have not to kill this person. But somehow or other, these reasons of humanity add up. And so eventually my reasons of humanity outweigh the liability justification. And that's partly because in each case, the liability justification is just grounded in the prevention of the death of one person. So you can see how the numbers matter here. Now, when I described this view in a publication, was attributing it to David, I added something to it that I can't remember whether this was in, David, your statement of the view or not, but I thought, well, this view would be more plausible if somehow or other my reason of humanity would be weaker the more culpable the threatener is. If we add that to the view, then we get the conclusion that the number of fully culpable assassins I would be permitted to kill would be much larger than the number of minimally responsible threateners I would be permitted to kill. But it's an implication of this view, it seems to me, that unless you impose some kind of threshold on the view, which strike me as slightly arbitrary, not just slightly, but utterly arbitrary, it's going to imply that there is a limit to the number of culpable assassins it can be permissible for me to kill. So and that's going to apply again to third-party defense of innocent people. So it's going to apply that there's some limit to the number of Hitlers we can permissibly kill in order to save some finite number of Jews from being killed by the Hitlers. And I just have doubts about that. That's a conclusion that I'm reluctant to embrace. It also seems to me that even though I offered this idea about discounting the strength of the reasons of humanity, the more culpable a threatening person is, it's not clear to me that that really makes sense, because we've already factored their culpability into the liability justification. It's double counting it to have it count in the reasons of humanity. The reasons of humanity ought to be constant. I mean, everybody's a vulnerable human being, some member of my group, whatever, participant in my form of life, whatever these reasons of humanity are supposed to be. They should apply equally. But if that's the case, then the view says that the limit to the number of fully culpable assassins I may kill in self or other defense is just the same as the limit to the number of minimally responsible threateners it can be permissible or proportionate for me to kill, and that seems to me implausible. Let me, in my remaining 5 minutes, try to explain another effort to understand how it is that there might be a limit to the number of minimally responsible killers I may permissibly kill, but not a limit to the number of fully culpable threateners I may be permitted to kill. The idea is this. When we've got an unavoidable harm and can affect how it's going to be distributed, we can affect this ex ante, The unavoidable harm ought to be distributed among people in proportion to their degree of responsibility for it, other things being equal. And there may be certain other considerations that are relevant, like whether one is a beneficiary of the events that have made this harm unavoidable, and so on and so forth. We'll put those aside. But the problem here is that these ideal distributions of harm are often not possible. Often, for example, there's an unavoidable harm and it's indivisible. We can't divide it among people in proportion to their responsibility for the fact that somebody's got to be harmed. So you might think that our notion of liability in these cases is this, that when the harm is indivisible, we decide the person who's most responsible for it, and the whole thing has to go to him, and then we say of that person, he's liable to it. And that's the way it seems to me to work in a lot of cases. So imagine that either BJ or I has to lose a leg, and BJ is 90% responsible for that situation, and I'm 10% responsible for it. But it's got to go to one or the other of us. Well, I think you're liable. You're 90%, I'm 10%. So BJ gets his leg whacked off. But then BJ can say to me, well, you're 10% responsible, and I have to agree, yeah, that's right. So maybe I owe BJ some compensation in this kind of case because I haven't had my fair share. That's an interesting thought. It conflicts with the idea that people who have suffered a harm to which they are liable can't be owed compensation for it because they were liable to it. Well, if our notion of liability functions in the way that I'm suggesting, maybe that's not plausible. Maybe that's not a reasonable inference. Maybe it is the case that people who are liable to suffer certain harm still deserve some degree of compensation, though perhaps never full compensation. So here's the idea. In a case like that, when BJ has taken more than his fair share of the harm, when I inflict that harm on him, the whole harm, there's a kind of residual injustice that's there that, that I could eliminate by compensating him. In the case of the minimally culpable threateners, the minimally responsible threateners who are queued up outside the door, in each case in which I kill one of these people in self-defense, there's going to be, arguably, some residual injustice because in some we just don't think that they're really liable to be killed. If it were possible somehow for me to take a little bit of the harm in order to prevent that person from having to be killed, maybe that would be the ideally just distribution or something of that sort. And maybe it's the case that these residual injustices would add up, so that the sum total of residual injustice in my killing 1,000 minimally responsible killers would exceed the injustice that I would suffer in allowing myself to be killed by them. If that would be true, then that might explain how it is that it would be impermissible, because disproportionate, for me to kill these 1,000 minimally responsible threateners. I tried to articulate this view in a couple of things that I've published. I remember talking about it with Matthias in Hamburg one time and arguing with David about it. You were there as well. And I've tried to fiddle around with this view. It's always struck me that there's something a bit fishy about it. It seemed to me the best I could do. But it was really Helen's former student, Jonathan Parry, who came to me with what seemed to be the right kind of challenge, which is, what in the world am I talking about when I talk about the ideally just distribution of the harm? What are the limits to that? And it seems to me I don't have any answer to that. So I'm really kind of, as a result of Jonathan's skepticism, I'm skeptical myself about whether that proposal is actually ever going to work. And if it won't, and if we're worried about the implications of David's view that just says the harms that are kind of counter-humanitarian or something add up and eventually outweigh the liability justification, if we're skeptical about that as well for the kind of reasons that I gave, the Hitler's example and so on, then I have nothing really to say about this contrast between the case of the 1,000 fully culpable assassins and the 1,000 minimally responsible people who will otherwise kill me. Seems to me a serious problem, but and maybe one of you will solve it for me. Maybe Dick's going to do that now. Thanks.